Hi, my name is Miranda Vaughn. I am a reference and archives librarian here at the Mississippi Library Commission. This is actually the first video in a four-part series that we are doing on researching Black ancestry. So thank you for joining us. So for part one of this series, we're actually just going to do a kind of introductory video. We're going to talk a little bit about the history of African Americans and things that you may already know or you may not know about how to get started with genealogy and Black history just in general. So thank you for joining us, and let's get started. So a little history about African Americans in this country. We usually think of the date 1619 as being kind of the quote unquote beginning of African American history in this country. But that isn't entirely accurate. That date is actually the date that slaves were, or enslaved people were first introduced in Jamestown, Virginia, which is an English colony. So, like a lot of our history, we focus a lot on what the English were doing in the colonies, but we tend to forget that there were other European countries who also had a very big and very vast history in the what is now the United States, and the founding of America, just in general. So I think that's why that date kind of sticks out, is because it looks at kind of the English side of the way our country was settled, but it's not entirely accurate. Prior to the year 1619, there were a number of Black people who were brought here either as enslaved people or as free people. Countries like Spain and Portugal had a lot of trading relationships with African nations. So they, of course, just like the English, had been exposed to Africans and had, business dealings with Africans and had incorporated Africans into their culture in one way or the other. And an example here on this slide, you see the first photo is of a portrait of Juan Garrido, who was an early Black explorer who actually came over with Christopher Columbus and traveled with him as a free Black sailor. There was another Black sailor who sailed with Ponce de Leon and on his voyages to the Americas, and that was all in the late early 1500s, all the way up to the 1619 date. There were multiple Africans who landed in like the Bahamas and like areas of the Caribbean. Some of them as enslaved people and some of them as not. And what you also need to understand about the enslaved versus free, at that point, the slavery that we think of in our history was not really a thing at that point. It didn't become the enterprise that it became until much later. So when you think about these early enslaved Africans who came, while some of them may have been more similar to the slaves that we think of now, a lot of them, if not most of them, were actually more like indentured servants. They were on contract. Maybe they had been put in that position for committing a crime or being accused of committing some sort of crime, but it wasn't any kind of lifetime role that they were given at that point. That didn't come into effect until much later on. So you have instances, before Jamestown, that shows us that like not every African or Black person who came to what is now the United States at that point is going to be enslaved. And that also brings us to the free African Americans who were living during what we would consider slave times. The people who were free, like Bishop D.A. Payne, who is in this, also featured in this slide. He was an educator, he was a preacher. He was born in 1811 in South Carolina as a free man, and he lived until the 1890s as a free man. And did what he could to educate Black Americans, and he lived through the Civil War and all of that. But he was never enslaved. He was born into freedom, and we don't hear those stories very often because they weren't the majority. They became a little bit more. It became a little bit more prevalent to see Black people born into freedom as time went on, and as you have like the northern states who had abolished slavery. But in the beginning, in the early years of settlement, you didn't see that as often. According to the Library of Congress in 1790, there was a recorded 60,000 African Americans who lived in the United States in freedom and not enslaved. In 1830, there were 300,000, and by 1860, there were 500,000 free African Americans who lived here. So, what I wanted to point out with that is when you are researching Black ancestry, when you're doing your genealogy, it's important to remember that it's possible that you may have ancestors who were not enslaved. If you're going into it thinking, okay, all of my ancestors are going to be enslaved, I can't find records on them, that's just the end of it. But that also may not be true. So it's important to kind of understand that history and kind of how slavery evolved over time to understand where your ancestors played into all of that. And I also wanted to point out this resource from LSU Libraries. I'll go ahead and pull it up here.
This is a collaborative digital collection from LSU Libraries. It's called Free People of Color in Louisiana. And this is just a list of the collections that they have. As you can see, there are collections from Tulane, Louisiana State Museum, New Orleans Public Library, and LSU. They have the collections, a lot of them are family papers, and it'll tell you what language they're in. You have a lot of French and English since it's Louisiana. A lot of the documents are probably going to be in French, so it lets you know if you might need some interpretation there. They have finding aids and cataloging records that you can look at. I wanted to share this resource because it's a good thing in genealogy research to look at surrounding states. Like if you're doing genealogy research in the state of Mississippi, it's okay to look at Louisiana and Tennessee and Alabama, because you may have had family who traveled, since those are the bordering states. So it can be helpful to look at some of those out-of-state records. And also, this particular collection does have information pertaining to parts of Mississippi. I know that they have some related to Natchez and those areas that are bordering the state of Louisiana. So you do have some information about Mississippi in this collection that could possibly be helpful to you, especially if you had family from that area. So yeah, just wanted to point out this resource in case you found anything on here helpful.
So, problems with researching Black ancestry. Let's start off talking about the records of the enslaved. First of all, those records are, how do I say this? Sometimes you hit the jackpot and you come across really good records where the people have names and decent descriptions and they're consistent over time. And you get really lucky if that is the case. But you have to think of the history of the enslaved as they were treated and thought of as property. So if you recorded your property, your candlesticks and your silverware and all of that, then you probably recorded whoever, if you had enslaved people. You did not do that sort of thing, or you did not keep up with it over time, or you maybe did not own a large plantation and you only had maybe one or two enslaved people, then you may not keep great records. It just kind of depends. And that is a really big stumbling block when it comes to Black genealogy, is that sometimes those records just don't exist. And sometimes they do exist, but they're not detailed enough. I mean, I've seen slave records that don't even give the person a name or anything. They describe them the way they would describe like a mule or something. Like this person has a birthmark on their hip and they can carry 500 pounds of cotton, and like just that sort of thing. And you don't get anything that's going to really give you what you're looking for, give you something to go on. You're having to kind of guess. And while we're on that subject, looking at slave records, for genealogists out there who are researching Black history or Black family history, and for librarians, archivists, anyone who may be assisting those people in researching their family history, it's important to point out that this can be a very mentally and emotionally draining task. And so it's like that for genealogy in general, because just depending on what you find in your family history, sometimes you can stumble upon some pretty gruesome things, no matter who you are. But specifically because we're dealing with a very dark history and records like this, it's important to just know going into it that there may be times where it does become emotionally overwhelming and just too much. And at that point, it's fine to take a break. I know it's easy if you do find a lot of good resources to kind of be on a roll and, go, just keep going until you get it done. But I think it's important to go into it with the mindset of, if I become too overwhelmed with the things that I discover about my family history or just in general, it's okay to take a break and step back and deal with whatever emotions you need to deal with, because a lot of this stuff can be pretty gruesome once you get into it. So when we're talking about researching Black ancestry, it's very rare that you're going to find super flowery, wonderful, happy stories. There's going to be a lot of sadness and anger and things like that in it. So I think that's something that you don't really talk about in the genealogy field, but I think that it's definitely a part of it, and it's something that you should be prepared for as a genealogist doing the actual research, and as a librarian or whatever kind of person that may be assisting in this. Just be prepared that might be an issue that comes up, and just be mindful of it and use your best judgment going forward with that. So that is, the slave records are definitely going to be something that may cause a stumbling block, and sometimes that's as far as people get in their family history. There's just nothing else that you really have evidence that you can pinpoint to go past that. So just be aware of that. Also, post-slavery records. After emancipation in 1865, there was a lot of separation. There was a lot of, some formerly enslaved people did stay near the farms and plantations where they had worked and possibly grown up, especially if they had family there. But you had a lot of people who left to just go start over fresh somewhere else. You had a lot of people who left to go try to find family members who had been sold off somewhere else, or who had been freed and were maybe in the north. And just, you have them going all different directions depending on the situation. And then you also have a lot of people who change their names if they were given names beforehand. So they could have changed it to anything and everything. You don't know. Some it was pretty common for some free people to take on the name of whoever their master was and let that be their last name. But a lot of people just started, like, came up with their own new names, like Freeman was a common one that they started calling themselves. So if you have a slave record that lists an ancestor of yours that had a particular name and was owned by a particular person, and they changed that name, they left afterwards, it was illegal for slaves to be taught to read and write. So the likelihood of them recording their own written records would have been very slim once they left. So sometimes they just sort of fall off. And, sometimes if you're lucky later on, you can, pick back up with them. But that happens a lot of times, and that's to be expected as well. That if there's not any really concrete evidence of where they went once they were freed, that you might not be able to find much about them later on. So that is a stumbling block. And then, as I mentioned, the illiteracy, they're not taught to read and write. A lot of them were able to attend the freedom schools that were put into place after emancipation and were taught to read and write in the future. But, many of them weren't, especially the ones who, maybe a generation later they were, but especially the ones who were freed in the 1860s. A lot of them couldn't read and write and weren't able to record their own records. So any records that they might have would be told vocally, orally, through oral histories and stories just being passed down from generation to generation. And it's important to take note that those oral histories are helpful in doing genealogy. It's kind of a gamble because it becomes very much like a game of telephone where you're just like, it goes through so many channels that once it gets to you in the modern day, you're just kind of like, I don't know how much of this is still true. Names may have been changed, places may have been changed, or you just might not have any kind of real idea of what in it is true or not. But usually if you dig around and you kind of think of it as a puzzle piece and you place together this and that and do a little research, you can kind of get an idea of what some of these, what the truths are in those stories. So don't discount them just because you think, well, they're probably at this point just completely false. Just pay attention to them, stories passed down from your grandparents and things like that, and just see if you can get any truth out of them, because it honestly might be really helpful in the future. So just a little bit about basic genealogy. If you're starting from scratch, it can be very overwhelming. So it's a lot of people want to do it, but put it off for a really long time because of how it can seem very overwhelming. So this is just a little bit of basic genealogy across the board for anyone. Start with what you know. That is a simple way of looking at it, and it will help you in the long run. Start with what you know. Start with the present and go to the past. Start with yourself, and then work your way back to, your parents, and then your grandparents, and your great-grandparents, and whoever may possibly be alive right now who that you could talk to, who has journals and things like that, photographs that they could share with you. Anybody who would have any knowledge of any of your family history, talk to them, get in touch with them, figure out what it is that they can contribute, record their information, and then go from there. That's the best way to start. You always work your way from the present and then work your way back to the past. And again, don't discount things like family Bibles, journals, photo albums, things that your family might have right now. A family reunion picture from 1999 where your grandmother and her 12 siblings are out at Sardis Lake, but especially if they're labeled. And that's another thing. Like, label your photographs, date your journals, date your photographs, put as much information as you can as possible so that people know the context of what it is you're producing. Family Bibles are really good tools for genealogy because if you're like my grandmother was, or if your grandmother is like my grandmother was, the Family Bible has all the death dates, all the birth dates, all the anniversaries, anything like major that happened. And this, my grandmother kept it in her personal Bible. And so family Bibles usually have even more information than that. As long as you have somebody who's kept up with it pretty well. Those death dates, those birth dates, those anniversaries, they can be super helpful. Even if it's just for a couple of generations, it helps out a lot and creates a really great timeline that can kind of keep you organized. And then, as I said before, oral histories. Talk to people, talk to your family members, find out what they know, take notes, record it, I mean, it's good to have oral histories on record anyway, just for historical purposes, just in general. But for family history especially, it can be really, really helpful to kind of navigate your way through it. This is just an example of a family tree. Family trees are just really good visuals. You don't have to stick to this when you're doing your family genealogy, and it can get pretty out of hand the further back you go. But it's just a neat way to sort of visualize in your head exactly what you're looking for, and the idea of things of people branching out from one another, and starting with yourself at the top and then moving down to the older generations as you go further down. So I just wanted to include this to just kind of give you a visual. And you can incorporate an actual family tree or a version of this with the different branches if that helps you organize things better. That can be a really good organizational tool because at some point you're probably going to end up with a lot of information that you're going to need to figure out a way to organize. And this is just kind of the go-to method of doing that and keeping things organized, keeping your information and the timelines in check, because the timelines can start to get confusing sometimes, especially when you start to deal with census records and things where people's names were spelled weird and there's some overlapping things there, which we'll talk a little bit more about in some of our other videos. But yeah, family tree, it never hurts to start off with it. If you want to trash it once you get further on, you think it's not really helpful anymore, that's fine, but I think it's a good starting point. So some other things that we're going to talk about, or just to kind of give you an idea of what we're going to talk about in the coming videos, databases and digital resources, websites like Ancestry.com, which I'm sure you've done any genealogy research or helped anyone do genealogy research, you've probably had some dealings with Ancestry. It's kind of the big one out there. So we're going to talk a little bit about that and talk a little bit about other digital resources that maybe you haven't heard of, or maybe you have heard of but haven't used. So give you an idea of those resources. Since a lot of those are resources that people can use at home. They don't necessarily need to come to the library, leave their home to come to the library or to the archive or wherever it may be. They can access those things from home. So we'll talk a little bit about those. We'll also talk about print resources, because print is not dead, y'all. It's not dead yet. There are a lot of really good print resources out there that are good resources for the genealogy research itself, and also good resources to give you guides to doing your own genealogy. So we'll talk a little bit about those. And then also how to navigate genealogy resources from a Black perspective, things like census records and military records and things like that, that you use just across the board with any genealogy projects. Sometimes if you're researching Black history or Black family history, then you will need to learn how to navigate them just a little bit differently, or certain things to look for that may be a little bit different specifically because of the content you're looking for. So we'll talk a little bit about that as well. So part 2 in the series, we're going to talk a little bit about national resources, which is basically things like the Library of Congress, the National Archives, and we'll talk about Ancestry.com on that one as well. Things that you can use on a national level or even on an international level as well, some of these things. So probably the more popular, well-known resources we'll talk about there. And then in part 3, we're going to talk about specifically Mississippi resources. We have a lot of good resources here at MLC and at libraries across the state, and digital collections that you may or may not have heard about. So we're going to focus in on some of those. And then in part 4, our last part, we're just going to talk about any kind of additional resources we want to throw in there and give you some guides and advice on how to research your Black ancestry, and just kind of wrap things up in that video. So if you have any questions about this video or this series or any of the future videos, please, please, please contact us. The reference staff here at the Library Commission is so excited to help in any way we possibly can. If you are a librarian or an archivist and you deal a lot with patrons who are researching genealogy and you have questions, or you feel like you might need a second pair of eyes to look over information, whatever it is you may need, definitely contact us. Our email is here on the screen. Our phone number is here on the screen. If you are a patron, if you yourself are doing genealogy research, feel free to reach out to us. Any questions you may have, we are here. We are glad to help. So thank you so much for watching this video. I hope it was helpful and informative, and stay tuned for our future videos. Thank you so much.